This episode touches on a further topic that highlights how deeply cultural maturity changes alter what life asks of us. I've written about it extensively through the years. We turn to how culturally mature perspective changes how we understand love and relationship more generally. It's a topic I address in depth in my book on the evolution of intimacy, a brief exploration of the past, present, and future of gender and love. We find major changes today in what love is asking of us. Much in these changes is not only more fundamental than we tend to realize, it is more fundamental than before we could have realized. This recognition is most obviously significant because of its implications for what it will require if we are to have fulfilling relationships in the future. But it is just as significant for the hard-to-refute evidence it provides for cultural maturity's broader, needed cultural growing up. We tend to regard love as we have known it in modern times, love of the Romeo and Juliet sort, as an ideal and endpoint. But it turns out that not only has love as we have known it not been some last word, it has not even been what we have assumed it to be about. Understanding just how this is so, and also what more is becoming possible, has major implications for understanding what our times are asking of us more generally. I first wrote about love's changes over 3 decades ago in an article I titled A New Meaning for Love. No piece I have written since has more often been cited. There I observed how intimate bonds throughout our most recent chapter in culture's story have involved two people, each functioning as parts, coming together to create a whole. Our job with love has been to find our better half. The result has been a reliable kind of magnetism. I also observed that while in its time the two halves makes a whole dynamic has provided a rich and effective kind of connecting, something different is being asked of us today. Increasingly, we are being challenged to connect not as two halves, but as separate whole beings. Bonding as two halves is a difficult security to surrender. But increasingly, we are finding that there is really no choice. When one part of us tries to make someone else our solution, another part quickly acts to undermine it. We find ourselves creating struggle, doing something to put the other person off, anything to regain our embryonic yet critical connection with a new sort of completeness in ourselves. Increasingly, it is becoming possible to love only the degree we can find ways to relate to another person while remaining whole in ourselves. For these changes to make complete sense, we need to step back for some big picture perspective. The simple notion that love is something that changes can be hard for people to get their minds around. We tend to assume that love is an eternal notion, that love is love. But in fact, love as we tend to think of it, romantic love, is a relatively recent cultural invention, a product of our modern age, and by all evidence, not an endpoint. Romantic love is appropriately celebrated. It has provided a powerful step forward in love's evolution toward, among other things, greater authority in our lives. Previously, love's determinations were made by families or by a matchmaker. But there is no reason to expect romantic love to be the end of love's story. In fact, the modern age Romeo and Juliet ideal represents something quite different from what we have assumed it to be about. We've tended to think of romantic love as love based on individual choice. But while choice set against the constraints of family expectations is without question much of what makes Romeo and Juliet a compelling tale, the modern age romantic ideal is not yet about individual choice in the sense of choosing as separate whole people. An additional recognition makes the need for something further even more clear and inescapably important. Love as we have known it necessarily involves distortion. With romantic love, the bond is created to the projection of parts of ourselves. With heterosexual bonds, men project more feminine parts of themselves onto women, and women do the reverse. And as always happens with projection, we also mythologize the other, in this case, making the other person the magic answer to our lives, or at least at less pleasant moments, the great cause of all our suffering. Not only is romantic love not yet love between whole people, it is not yet love that reflects who the two people involved actually are. The fact that love as we have witnessed it to this point has been based on projection becomes obvious with reflection. Projection is what makes it possible to fall quickly in love with no real knowledge of the other person. It is also what makes it possible for the sound of wedding bells at a movie's conclusion to assure us that the protagonists will live happily ever after, when in fact love's journey has barely begun. The common result when we fall out of love provides evidence that is even more inescapable. People tend to assume that we will then have distaste, even antipathy for the other person, which with high frequency is what in fact we feel. Notice that this outcome makes no sense if love has been between two whole people, if we have loved each other simply for who we are. The ending of such a relationship could bring significant sadness, but only in very unusual circumstances would antipathy be warranted. Why do we assume it? When love involves projection, antipathy is needed in order to extract the projected part and regain our full sense of ourselves. Up until very recently, romantic love's projective dynamics have served us. Much of the glue of relationships, the magnetism of love, and the basis of commitment has come from this giving away of key dimensions of ourselves to the other. Not only have these mechanisms benefited us, they have made love possible. Making the other our answer has shielded us from uncertainties and complexities that could not before have been tolerated. They have also shielded us from limits to what one person can ultimately be for another. But like it or not, two halves make a whole relating is ceasing to work. As a therapist, increasingly I find people seeking more complete kinds of connecting. This is not also always what we find. Indeed, images of whole person love are rare in popular culture. What we see with The Bachelor and the like is pretty much the opposite. But I don't see more whole person love as some luxury. I think the future of intimacy depends on our ability to realize this new and fuller kind of connecting. In my book on the evolution of intimacy, I describe how love is not the only place where projective dynamics have impacted our intimate lives. They have also been central to why men and women through history have tended to be perceived as opposites. The more systemic view of the world that comes with culturally mature perspective doesn't make men and women suddenly the same, but it does make us much more similar and diverse in our sensibilities than we have historically assumed. In a related way, culture matures cognitive changes also offer that we might understand friendship in more complete ways. In the book, I write about how bringing culturally mature perspective to sexuality and gender-related questions is essential if today's changes are to ultimately serve us. I also describe how doing so takes us beyond popular thinking about what will be required. Equal rights, equal opportunity, and equal safety are essential to moving forward, but they primarily have to do with finishing up the modern age project, that which started with the Bill of Rights. The way cultural maturity changes and invites the possibility of more whole person systemic understandings of identity reflects essential further steps. In the book, I describe a litmus test for success with these further developmental steps. Modern age changes by themselves do nothing to reconcile the historical battle of the sexes. Consistent with this, the result with changes to this point is often to exacerbate it. A key part of the outcome with cultural maturity of changes is a deepening of respect and understanding all the way around. Another way we encounter our now familiar apparent paradox. What cultural maturity provides is fundamentally new and newly demanding. But at the same time, the result ultimately is common sense. At these most personal of levels, it helps us better appreciate ourselves and others as simply who we are. As always, I invite your thoughts and questions.